Britain, the 1970s. A decade of grand promises on four wheels. And sitting right at number 1 is a car that looked and sounded exactly like a proper Grand Tourer, but turned out to be genuinely hollow underneath. Stick around, because that story alone is worth the wait. Before we get into it, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now, let's count down 10 British luxury cars that promised far more than they ever actually delivered. Number 10. Vanden Plas 1500. The Vanden Plas 1500 arrived in 1974 as British Leyland's attempt to dress up the humble Austin Allegro in something resembling genuine prestige. Built at Longbridge alongside its ordinary Allegro siblings, the 1500 added a traditional upright grille, walnut veneer dashboard trim, and leather seating in an effort to justify a considerably higher price tag than the standard car sitting on the same production line. Vanden Plas had a genuine coach-building heritage stretching back decades, which made the badge feel like a meaningful promise to buyers who remembered the name from earlier, more distinguished Rolls-Royce and Princess models. Underneath the veneer, it remained an Allegro in every mechanical respect, sharing the same hydrogous suspension, the same modest engine options, and, critically, the same structural weaknesses that had made the standard Allegro notorious. Buyers who'd paid extra specifically for the Vanden Plas badge found themselves owning a car with genuine leather seats bolted into a body shell that could still, under the wrong circumstances, flex enough to pop its own rear windscreen out. Contemporary critics were blunt about the mismatch, pointing out that no amount of traditional trim could disguise a structural flaw that undermined the very idea of premium quality. The prestige was entirely cosmetic, applied to a car whose fundamental problems no amount of walnut trim could disguise. Number 9. Wolseley 6. The Wolseley 6, launched in 1972 as one of the final products to carry the historic Wolseley badge before British Leyland retired it altogether, offered a 6-cylinder engine and traditional trim wrapped around mechanical underpinnings shared with the more mainstream Austin and Morris 1800 range. It represented, in many ways, the last gasp of an older approach to British prestige, the idea that a fancier badge and a slightly bigger engine were enough to justify a genuinely premium price. The illuminated grille badge, long a Wolseley trademark, still glowed reassuringly on the motorway at night, a small ritual that loyal buyers had genuinely valued for generations. By the early 1970s, that formula had stopped convincing buyers. The car's styling looked dated next to newer European rivals, and the badge engineering approach felt increasingly transparent to customers who could see the ordinary Austin underneath the illuminated Wolseley grille badge. Reviewers of the period noted, often kindly but pointedly, that the interior fittings simply couldn't disguise the mechanical similarity to cheaper models sitting in the same showroom. Sales never recovered, and the marque itself was discontinued within a few years, a quiet end for a name that had once meant genuine distinction on British roads. Number 8. Austin 3 Litre. The Austin 3 Litre, launched in 1968 and sold into the early 1970s, represented British Leyland's most ambitious and most thoroughly misjudged attempt at a genuine flagship saloon. Built at Longbridge, it paired a smooth 6-cylinder engine and hydroelastic suspension with a body shell that, awkwardly, shared its basic doors and window frames with a much smaller Austin 1800, a decision that left the finished car looking oddly proportioned, neither compact nor genuinely large. The engineering underneath was, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely competent, which made the finished product's failure all the more frustrating for the team behind it. Buyers who might have considered a Rover or a Triumph instead found a car that couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Interior space in the back seats disappointed anyone expecting genuine limousine comfort, and the awkward styling did the car no favors in a market where image mattered as much as engineering. Motoring journalists at the time were openly puzzled by the styling decisions, noting that a car aiming for genuine prestige needed to look the part from every angle, not just share convenient panels with a cheaper stablemate. Fewer than 10,000 were ever sold before British Leyland quietly discontinued it, an expensive and very public demonstration that badge and price alone couldn't manufacture genuine prestige. Would you have chosen this over a Rover P6 at the same price point? Let us know in the comments. Number 7. Triumph 2500 Pi. The Triumph 2500 Pi, sold through the early 1970s from Coventry, offered something genuinely appealing on paper. A 6-cylinder luxury saloon with Lucas mechanical fuel injection, delivering sportier performance than most rivals in its class alongside genuinely comfortable, well-appointed interiors trimmed in leather and wood. Triumph marketed it directly at buyers who wanted the comfort of a Rover with noticeably more urgency under the right foot, a genuinely distinct proposition in the class at the time. The fuel injection system, however, proved to be the car's undoing. Lucas's mechanical injection was notoriously difficult to keep properly tuned, and specialist knowledge was required to service it correctly, knowledge that many ordinary dealership mechanics simply didn't have. Owners regularly experienced rough running, poor cold starting, and expensive repair bills for a system that, when working correctly, offered genuine performance benefits few owners ever consistently enjoyed. The gap between the car's advertised performance figures and what most owners actually experienced day to day grew into a genuine source of frustration and, eventually, distrust. Triumph eventually reverted many models to conventional carburetors, a quiet admission that the ambitious injection system had caused more frustration than it had ever delivered in genuine driving pleasure. Number 6. Jensen Interceptor. The Jensen Interceptor, built at West Bromwich throughout the 1970s, cut a genuinely striking figure, an Italian-styled grand tourer body wrapped around a thumping Chrysler V8 engine, offering effortless power and real presence on British roads. For a brief window, it looked like Britain had produced a genuine rival to the finest Continental GT cars, and celebrity owners and glowing early reviews only reinforced that impression. Then the 1973 oil crisis arrived, and the Interceptor's enormous V8 thirst became a genuine liability rather than a charming eccentricity, with fuel consumption figures that made regular ownership a serious financial commitment even for wealthy buyers. Handmade construction methods meant build quality varied considerably between individual cars, and the small company's finances were never especially secure, leaving owners anxious about long-term parts supply and dealer support. Jensen Motors itself eventually collapsed into receivership before the decade was out, confirming the very anxieties that cautious buyers had felt from the beginning. It was thrilling in short bursts and genuinely stressful to actually live with, a car whose glamour struggled to survive contact with the realities of 1970s Britain. Number 5. Daimler Sovereign. The Daimler Sovereign, sold throughout the 1970s from Coventry, occupied an increasingly uncomfortable position within British Leyland's model range, mechanically almost identical to the contemporary Jaguar XJ6, but wearing a Daimler badge and a fluted grille in an attempt to justify charging a genuine premium for what amounted to the same car underneath. Daimler's name had once meant royal patronage and genuinely distinct engineering, a legacy the badge alone was now being asked to carry almost entirely on its own. Buyers who'd chosen Daimler specifically for its historical association with genuine engineering distinction found, in practice, a car built on the same production line, using the same engines, and suffering the same industrial quality control problems that plagued Jaguar throughout the decade. Dealer literature of the period still spoke of Daimler refinement and exclusivity, but the cars rolling off the line told a more honest story to anyone who looked closely. The badge no longer represented a meaningfully different engineering approach, just a different grille and a higher price tag, and increasingly sophisticated buyers noticed the difference, or rather, the lack of one. Number 4. Rolls-Royce Camargue. The Rolls-Royce Camargue, launched in 1975 and hand-built at Mulliner Park Ward, arrived as the most expensive British production car of its era, styled by the Italian house Pininfarina and positioned as the ultimate expression of Rolls-Royce prestige. Every detail of its arrival had been carefully choreographed to reinforce that image, from the exclusive unveiling events to the hushed, reverent tone of the motoring press coverage that preceded it. Anticipation among wealthy buyers ran genuinely high before launch, with the Pininfarina name alone promising a level of design sophistication no in-house British effort could easily match. Waiting lists began forming before a single production car had even left the factory, with buyers willing to commit substantial deposits on reputation and rumor alone. Rolls-Royce, for its part, did little to dampen the growing sense that this would be the definitive statement of the marque for a new decade. What arrived divided opinion sharply and, for many, disappointed outright. The controversial squared-off styling aged poorly even by contemporary standards, striking some observers as ungainly rather than elegant, a strange departure from the flowing, timeless lines that had defined Rolls-Royce for generations. Critics who had expected Pininfarina's Italian sensibility to soften and modernize the marque's traditional silhouette instead found a boxy, almost brutal design that seemed to fight against everything the brand had once stood for. The interior, while beautifully finished in the traditional Rolls-Royce manner, with acres of hand-stitched leather and carefully selected veneers, offered less genuine innovation than the enormous price tag seemed to demand. Buyers examining the cabin closely noticed that much of what they were paying such an extraordinary premium for was, in essence, familiar Rolls-Royce craftsmanship rather than anything meaningfully new. Air conditioning systems fitted to early cars struggled to cope reliably, an almost unforgivable oversight on a car costing more than most British houses at the time. It was, in the eyes of many owners, a small but symbolically devastating failure. A flagship car unable to reliably deliver basic comfort, undermining the very promise of effortless luxury the Camargue was built around. Dealers fielded complaint after complaint from owners who had expected flawless engineering to match the flawless price tag. Owners who had spent that kind of money expecting a genuine leap forward instead found many of the same underlying mechanical components as less expensive Rolls-Royce models, simply wrapped in a body that not everyone agreed was actually more attractive. For buyers spending that kind of money, the Camargue felt less like the ultimate Rolls-Royce and more like an expensive styling exercise that hadn't been fully thought through. A car that promised revolution and delivered, at best, a very costly variation on a familiar theme. Number 3, Rover 3500 SD1. The Rover 3500, launched in 1976 to genuine critical acclaim and the European Car of the Year award, promised to combine dramatic Italian-influenced styling with a smooth V8 engine and genuine executive comfort at a price considerably lower than its German rivals. It arrived at a moment when British industry desperately needed a symbol of renewed confidence, and for a brief period, the SD1 seemed to be exactly that symbol. Showroom queues formed, and journalists who'd driven early press cars wrote about the SD1 in genuinely glowing terms, convinced Rover had finally produced something to worry Mercedes and BMW. The hatchback practicality combined with genuine executive presence felt, on paper and on the road in those first carefully prepared test cars, like a masterstroke that finally proved British engineering could compete on the world stage. The reality, once cars reached actual driveways, undercut almost everything the launch had promised. Paintwork blistered within months, sometimes revealing bare metal beneath in a matter of weeks rather than years. Electrical systems failed unpredictably, with dashboard warning lights flickering on and off seemingly at random and components refusing to work in damp weather. Assembly line shortcuts, later admitted by workers themselves, meant panels didn't always align correctly and components weren't always properly fitted, the consequence of rushed production schedules and industrial disputes that plagued the factory floor throughout the car's early life. Some of the very journalists who had praised the car at launch found themselves writing embarrassed follow-up pieces once their own long-term test cars began developing faults, a reversal that did lasting damage to the SD1's reputation and, by extension, to Rover's credibility as a builder of dependable executive cars. Buyers who'd chosen the SD1 specifically for its executive prestige found themselves visiting dealers with embarrassing frequency for a car that was supposed to represent Rover's finest work, often for the same recurring issues that never seemed to be fully resolved no matter how many times the car went in for repair. The styling and the engine remained genuinely impressive throughout, sharp, wedge-shaped, and years ahead of its rivals in terms of visual drama, but the ownership experience around them felt increasingly hollow the longer any individual car stayed on the road. What should have been Rover's crowning achievement instead became a cautionary tale about the gap between a brilliant concept and the discipline required to build it properly. Tell us in the comments, did the SD1's styling win you over despite everything else? Number 2. Jaguar XJ12 Series 2. Jaguar XJ12 Series 2. The Jaguar XJ12 Series 2, produced at Browns Lane from 1973, paired the already refined XJ6 body with a genuinely remarkable V12 engine, delivering a smoothness and silence that few rivals anywhere in the world could match at any price. It represented, in many ways, the absolute peak of what British engineers were capable of when given the freedom to chase perfection without compromise. On pure engineering merit, it deserved to be regarded as one of the finest luxury saloons Britain had ever produced, and independent testers of the era frequently said as much without hesitation, praising the effortless refinement of the V12 and the sense of occasion that came with simply starting the engine. For a moment, it seemed as though Jaguar had solved the puzzle that so many of its rivals struggled with, combining genuine performance with true luxury car serenity. Industrial disputes and chronic underinvestment at British Leyland, which had absorbed Jaguar, meant that genuine engineering brilliance was regularly let down by inconsistent assembly. Cars that rolled off the same production line on different days could vary noticeably in fit, finish, and reliability, depending on which shift had built them and how disrupted that particular week's production schedule had been by strikes or parts shortages. Electrical gremlins plagued early Series 2 cars specifically, with owners reporting warning lights that illuminated for no discernible reason and accessories that worked intermittently at best, from power windows that refused to close to instrument clusters that behaved erratically regardless of how many times they were serviced. Fuel consumption from the V12, already substantial before the 1973 oil crisis, became a genuine burden afterward, turning what should have been effortless long-distance cruising into a calculation of fuel stops, with owners increasingly forced to weigh the car's magnificent refinement against its punishing running costs. Buyers were, in effect, purchasing two different cars in one, a magnificent engine and chassis wrapped in a build quality that consistently failed to match the ambition underneath it, leaving even the most loyal Jaguar owners torn between genuine admiration for what the car could do and quiet frustration with how often it needed attention to keep doing it. Number 1. Triumph Stag. And that brings us to number 1. The British luxury car that promised the most and delivered, for many owners, the least. Few cars in British motoring history managed to combine such genuine ambition with such a devastating, fundamental flaw. The Triumph Stag, launched in 1970 from Coventry, looked every inch the genuine British answer to the great Continental Grand Tours, a striking convertible body designed with input from Michelotti in Italy, wrapped around a brand new 3.0-liter V8 engine developed specifically for the car, offering genuine performance and open-top glamour that few British manufacturers had ever attempted to match. It was a car built to compete directly with Mercedes and other European Grand Tours, and on looks alone, it more than held its own. Early press reception was genuinely enthusiastic, and the Stag looked, for a moment, like exactly the kind of confident, stylish statement British motoring needed, a car that suggested Triumph was ready to step into rarefied territory usually reserved for far more expensive continental marques. Buyers queued up, drawn in by the elegant proportions, the purposeful roll bar, and the promise of a genuinely bespoke V8 engine built exclusively for this one model. Underneath that glamour sat an engine with a fundamental design flaw. The V8's cooling system was chronically prone to overheating, largely due to a combination of poor water flow design and, in many cases, corrosion within the cooling passages themselves caused by mixing incompatible metals during construction, an engineering oversight that would come to define the car's entire reputation. Overheating led directly to warped cylinder heads and blown head gaskets, sometimes within just a few thousand miles of ownership, turning what should have been a glamorous weekend car into a source of genuine anxiety every time the temperature gauge crept upward. Many owners, and eventually many dealers, resorted to swapping in more reliable Rover or Triumph engines entirely, effectively admitting that the car's signature power plant simply couldn't be trusted as delivered. It became something of an open secret within the classic car world, a genuine factory-fitted Stag V8 that had never once overheated or needed major work was, and remains, a rare and celebrated exception rather than the rule. The tragedy of the Stag is that everything else about it worked. The styling remained genuinely beautiful for decades afterward, aging into a design so well loved that the car eventually became a firm favorite on the classic car circuit despite its troubled history. The driving experience, when the engine cooperated, delivered exactly the glamorous grand touring feeling the car had promised. Wind in your hair, a genuinely characterful V8 burble, and styling that turned heads wherever it went. But an unreliable heart at the center of an otherwise excellent car meant that the Stag's luxury and glamour were, for far too many owners, resting on a foundation that could fail without warning. Hollow, in the most literal engineering sense, right where it mattered most. It remains, even today, one of the clearest examples in British automotive history of a car let down not by lack of ambition, vision, or style, but by a single, entirely avoidable engineering mistake. British luxury in the 1970s often promised more than the industry behind it could consistently deliver. On paper, these were some of the most desirable cars in the world, beautifully proportioned, richly appointed, engineered by people who genuinely understood what a luxury car should feel like. On the showroom floor, wrapped in walnut veneer and soft leather, they looked every inch the equal of anything coming out of Germany or Italy. The trouble was what happened after the sale. Some of these cars were let down by badge engineering that fooled nobody for long, dressing up ordinary mechanicals in walnut and leather and hoping buyers wouldn't look too closely underneath. A different grille, a plusher interior, a more expensive badge on the boot lid, and underneath, the same floor pan, the same engine, the same humble family car sold at a considerable markup. Buyers weren't stupid. Word got around fast, and once it did, no amount of extra chrome could rebuild the trust that badge engineering had spent. Others were genuinely excellent designs undermined by the industrial chaos surrounding British Leyland throughout the decade. Brilliant engines and beautiful bodies let down by strikes, underinvestment, and assembly lines under impossible pressure. Cars that had been engineered with real ambition rolled off production lines staffed by workers who were exhausted, underpaid, and frequently out on the picket line the following week. Panel gaps that should never have left the factory. Electrics that failed within months. Paintwork that bubbled before the car had done 10,000 miles. None of it was a failure of design. It was a failure of everything that had to happen after the design was finished. And at least one asked buyers to trust a beautiful body built around an engine that simply couldn't be relied upon. A car so stunning to look at that people bought it in spite of everything they'd heard, only to discover the stories were true. Overheating. Head gasket failures. Engines that seized on cars with barely any miles on the clock. It remains one of the great tragedies of British motoring, a design good enough to turn heads 40 years later, paired with mechanicals that couldn't be trusted to get you home. None of this happened because British engineers lacked talent or ambition, quite the opposite. Time and again, these cars showed genuine flashes of world-class design and engineering thinking, from Jaguar's remarkable V12 to the Stag's genuinely lovely styling. The ideas were there. The talent was there. In isolated pockets, entirely brilliant cars were built by entirely brilliant people. What they consistently lacked was the industrial stability, the quality control, and sometimes simply the engineering patience to see those ideas through to a finished product buyers could actually trust for the price they paid. It's a peculiarly British kind of tragedy, not a lack of vision, but a total inability to execute that vision consistently, decade after decade, car after car. And it's why, even now, these cars occupy such a strange place in the national imagination, adored and mistrusted in equal measure, celebrated at classic car shows and quietly avoided as daily drivers. Which of these disappointing luxury cars surprised you most? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to Britain Rewind for more stories from the roads that shaped this nation. Until next time.